Now, there's all sorts of different types of forecasts, different forecasting methods, but we can generally classify them under three different types. Now, the first is what we call judgmental forecasts. Judgmental forecasts are, we basically ask experts. We find opinions. We ask people who generally know what they're doing as to what they expect the future to hold. So we get opinions. We get opinions from customer surveys. We get opinions from management. We get opinions from sales staff. So we ask people who generally know what's going on what they expect the future to hold. This is really useful for cases where you don't have any past data. If there's no past data, what do? It's kind of hard to come up with any of the other types of forecasts because if you don't have the past data, it's hard to work with. So in those cases, you go for a judgmental forecast. You seek opinions from people who generally know what they're talking about. Now, there's been a lot of interesting research done in this area in the past 5 to 10 years. The problem with judgmental forecasts is how do you get an accurate result? How do you get the truth from the people you're asking? Now keep in mind, if you ask people in a group, suddenly you have all the various methods of groupthink going on. So you could have a case where one person's opinion affects another's. So how do you get to the heart of the matter? How do you get people to actually tell you the truth? Well, one of the interesting tools that's been used recently is a nice little tool called the Iowa Electronic Market. And this was something that some colleagues were working on back when I was a grad student. Basically how it works is this. You give experts a little bit of money and you ask them to buy shares in a possible future event, such as a candidate winning a particular election or the severity of a flu outbreak in a given week. And it turns out that when you ask people to buy shares in in an event happening, and suppose that if this event actually happens, then the share pays out $1. If it doesn't happen, it pays out 0. It turns out that the price at which these shares trade, well, turns out that it's actually pretty accurate to what people think of with regard to the probability of that event happening. So if these shares are trading about like they would normally trade in a stock market, well, you find that people end up being remarkably honest about what they actually think with regard to the probability of events happening. So, just an idea as to how to sidestep some of the issues that come from asking a group of people what they really think. Now, the second method is the easiest to use. It's a time series forecast. Basically, you take past events and you project them into the future. And we're going to talk about several different time series forecasting methods over the course of this chapter. It's easy to use, really easy to use. Just, you assume history repeats itself, more or less. Maybe literally repeats itself, maybe kind of sort of repeats itself, but you expect history to repeat. And then there's this third one. And the third one, called associative forecasting, is my personal favorite because you get to the heart of the matter. You get to explaining why events happen. So you look for possible explanatory variables to predict what could happen. So, our sales for a given month are a certain amount. Well, that would be affected by certain factors. It would be affected by, what month it is, for instance. It would be affected by how much you spent on advertising. It would be dependent on a number of different factors, and you could use those factors, those explanatory variables, to predict what the future holds. So, there's 3 main types of forecasts to remember. Judgmental forecasts, where you use opinions from people generally in the know. Time series forecasts, where you generally predict that the future will repeat itself, that past events will project into the future. And associative forecasting, where you use explanatory variables to predict what the future holds. So, now we get to the second rule of forecasting. And the second rule is kind of interesting because it seems almost counterintuitive. And that is that forecasts are almost always wrong. Case in point. Imagine the next sporting event that you are concerned about. And I don't know what time of year this is that you're listening it to. You know, currently recording it for the summer of 2015. But think of the next sporting event that you're concerned about. What's the score of that sporting event going to be? Can you predict it exactly? Well, probably not. But you could get close. And that's the point of forecasting. You're not going to get exact. You're not going to predict exactly what's going to happen. But you can get fairly close. You want to get fairly close. So, if forecasts are almost always wrong, why? Well, variation. Things change from situation to situation, from moment to moment. And that variation can take a whole bunch of different forms. So what causes this variation? Well, you could have a trend. A trend is a sustained upward or downward movement in the data. So we want sales to increase. If our sales are continually increasing, that's a trend. If sales are continually decreasing, that's a trend. Seasonality and cycles. Things tend to cycle according to various things. Seasonality. Here, we expect, for instance, sales of winter coats to not be so well in summer, but we expect sales of winter coats to be very high as we get into fall and winter. And so that's seasonality, that up and down variation in data based on the calendar. Now, cycles are up and down variations in data that aren't based on the calendar. A good way of thinking about this: economic cycles. You have this, boom and bust that tends to happen with regard to economies. Things are going well, economy starts building up, starts getting better, and then, competition sets in as some companies start falling by the wayside, and then, companies start failing, and suddenly the economy starts going downhill, and then goes downhill for a while, and companies that weren't so healthy get out of the market, so that all that's left is healthy companies, and then those healthy companies start building up again, and the economy starts getting well again, and so you have these economic cycles, these up and down variations that occur. Now, these last two are kind of interesting. Irregular variations. This is shocks to the system. This is unusual circumstances. Really good example. Hopefully you've heard of an author by the name of Mitch Albom. He's written a number of books. 5 People You Meet in Heaven, Tuesdays with Morrie, For One More Day. Well, once upon a time, Albom was a sports writer. He worked for the Detroit Free Press. And due to a strike at the paper, he was idle for a while. In other words, didn't have any work to do. Well, he heard that one of his old professors was dying of leukemia. And so he decided that, since he had a lot of time on his hands, he would go and visit that professor. Those visits eventually became a book called Tuesdays with Morrie. And so the book was released, and there were, some sales, but it didn't go so well. The problem is, marketers didn't know what to do with the book. You see, Albom was a sports writer. Tuesdays with Morrie was not a sports book. So how do you market this? Well, the publishers didn't know, so it was not selling very well. And then Oprah got a hold of it. And when Oprah gets a hold of a book and puts a book on her show and talks about a book on her show, sales will skyrocket. That's irregular variation. That is variation due to unusual circumstances occurring. Now the last the last is what we call random variation. And random variation is all the little things that occur in our lives. It's the variations from everything else. The problem, a good way of thinking about it, what are you going to have for supper? Where are you going to eat? Well, you might eat at home, you might eat at a restaurant, but maybe you've made that decision yet, maybe you haven't. But what is that decision? So you make the decision, you decide to go to one particular restaurant, and you eat at that restaurant. Well, that increases the sales for that one restaurant, right? And it doesn't increase the sales for the other restaurant. So there's a little variation there. Well, that's your variation. Here's the thing. Right now, everybody else is making the same decisions. So imagine all of these little decisions coming together. That's random variation. So, variation, this is what causes forecasting to be a hit or miss, but mostly miss affair. The idea is you get close, but you can't take everything into account. It's kind of hard to take every form of variation into account. In fact, it's impossible to take every form of variation into account. As for why, well, I'll talk about that in a little more detail in the next lecture. Thank you.